something that I made bolded intentionally in the font in the text is the words that they are using. As far as I remember, and I might be a bit wrong of this, but as far as I know, even Purim, which a lot of people would consider a bigger holiday than Hanukkah, specifically given the biblical book of Esther, the rabbis don't call it a Yom Tov. Yom Tov, which literally just means good day, but it's basically the Hebrew for a holiday. And it's the same word that we use for the 3 pilgrimage festivals for Sukkot and Pesach and Passover and Shavuot. They use it here for Hanukkah. And it's something that keeps repeating. It is already mentioned in the book of Maccabees, which, as I said, is a book written in the 1st or 2nd century BC. And throughout time, so when people constantly say it's a minor holiday, there is no reference to that in the rabbinical text. They call it a holiday. They say they have turned it into a holiday, and that's how they talk about it. But that is they still make it very clear you're allowed to work. Though we'll see in a minute, there was historically people who even pushed back against that. But the word that they use, they don't say they made it a small holiday. One thing that becomes very important is what they mention is Hallel, the recitation of Hallel, which is the recitation of several chapters of Psalms that is traditionally recited on holidays. Hanukkah is the only non-biblical holiday, the only holiday is mentioned in the Bible where it's actually recited, but it's not just recited on Hanukkah, but on Hanukkah it is recited in greater length than on some biblical holidays, specifically the second part of Passover and on Rosh Chodesh, the first day of every month. That is also a holiday mentioned as celebratory in the Bible already. So the fact where they're saying they made it a holiday and they instituted the saying of Hallel is what turns this into a holiday to some extent in the same level as biblical holidays, which are the only other holidays. So even Purim is not considered a holiday to the context where you recite Hallel. You don't on Purim. Hanukkah you do. There's a lot more to talk about, and there's a lot of things that I'm seeing popping up. And I'm not going to deny that in Talmudic times and probably for 1,000 years after, it was... Again, this is the part where I wouldn't use the term minor holiday, but it was on a holiday on a very different level than, let's say, many of the other holidays that we have. I want to go through a few more before I open up, give a space for questions. I'm going to go back to sharing the text, and we're going to read a few more texts, and then we'll take some space for some questions. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read source number 2? It's a very short one.
So I put the 7 and I put the...
As it is written in the writings of the Arizal, that the main end of the Gmar Tov, the final sealing of how one's year will go, is on Chanukah.
This is where it takes it to a whole new level. So this is something that is based, something that I've mentioned, Kabbalistic, like the person, this is from a Hasidic text of the 18th century called Bat Ayin. One of the reasons I started today it was yesterday, is actually his yahrzeit, the anniversary of his death. He was an early Hasidic rabbi who wrote a lot, but more importantly, here he quotes the Ari, he quotes Rabbi Isaac Luria, the father of modern Kabbalah, who lived in the 16th century in Sifat, in the Ottoman Empire. Very much not influenced by a society where Christmas was the norm in any way or form. Not just that, as far as I know, I don't think the Ottoman Empire had any holiday during this time. And he is taking it up a notch a bit. It's not just a holiday. It is the end, the Gemar HaChatima. So usually we know that blessing Gemar Chatima Tova from Yom Kippur. Or some texts later on moved it up to Hoshana Rabbah, the last day of Sukkot, where kind of you are finally sealed into hopefully a good year, a good life. We see that happening on the high holidays. We see that happening at the end of Sukkot. According to the Ari, the father of modern Kabbalah, that actually happens on Hanukkah. A very literal taking Hanukkah from what some of you would see as minor status all the way to, actually, this is the high holidays. And then the next one goes another step. Does anyone want to read source number 3?
What the most righteous person can ask and get from the Hashem through tshuva and prayer on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the high holidays, can even the most simple person ask and get from Hashem on Zos Chanukah, the 8th day of Hanukkah.
But this is something that I grew up a lot with, and this is not the only text. There's a lot of texts. This is from a 19th century Hasidic text, but there's references to it earlier. And as you saw in the last text, going back to, it's based on 16th century Kabbalistic teachings, where they're literally saying not just that it's as big or on the level of like high holidays to some extent, on a spiritual level at least. The last day of Hanukkah, according to this specific text, and again, it's based on, I'm not going to give the whole Kabbalistic, but it's based on this idea that the first 7 days represent the seven, the 7 virtues, the 7 like Chesed, Gvura, Teferet, and so on from Kabbalah that we know, and the 8th day is above all of that, but literally to an extent where like the high holy days are very high and very important and all about Shuvah and repentance and really righteous people, which is a theme that actually runs through the high holidays, where the Talmud says that like really good people are prescribed on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, other people wait until Yom Kippur or even longer. This teaching is saying that Hanukkah, at least the last day, is even higher than any of those days. And even someone who isn't righteous, even the most simple person, whoever that might be, and whoever would identify with that, can accomplish on that day what otherwise would take a really righteous person to accomplish. Okay. Now, I want to say a few more things, and then I want to open for questions about the text that we have just gone through. So start thinking of how much you want to argue with me and how much you want to push back if that's what you want to do. And very importantly, I will say again, 2 things. I'm in no way attempting to say that this is on a halacha, on like a legalistic way of what we perceive a holiday to be, where like you're not allowed to work and you have to do very specific different prayers and so on. We're not attempting to argue with that. I'm also not attempting to argue that all Jews throughout all of history have seen Chanukah as a very major holiday. What we do see here is that in many different religious communities, including texts coming out of areas that were not Christian normative, that were not where Christmas wasn't even a big deal, have definitely on a spiritual level and even in some literal way, as we'll see later, taken Hanukkah to be a really, pardon my language, a really effing big deal. And like I grew it, and that's where I will say some of the music that you heard at the beginning, which was Hasidic Hanukkah music. For me, growing up in a Hasidic community, I can't say we were not influenced by Christmas at all in any way or form. Like we would see the Christmas lights. But let me just tell you that I personally, and I'm not saying that was the case for all Hasidic people, but I personally grew up in a family where I didn't even know that Thanksgiving existed. So like my influence from the outside world was quite limited. And Hanukkah was a really big deal spiritually. And it also had an impact on like Hanukkah was in no way just another day where it happens during sunset, you light candles. The entire day in every way was really impacted. And then Zot Hanukkah, specifically in my community, was just straight up the high holidays in many different ways, including even the morning prayers had additions and songs that were straight out of the high holidays. And then there would be a big tish, which is a gathering with a Rebbe where we would sing most of the songs, again, high holiday songs. And it was a very like serious moment, something that you don't expect even from Hanukkah. It was just directly a very high holiday vibes in a day-to-day, it was very dear. It wasn't just in a spiritual way. It wasn't the food, it wasn't the songs, it wasn't the music, it wasn't the even the way we would dress. To some extent, it wasn't as like some other holidays, but it wasn't like a weekday and so on. Okay. Keep in mind that we're still going to go through a lot of different texts, but I want to open up to get some questions. You can either okay, we're going to do that. How about raise your hand? So if you go to the bottom on the React, at the bottom of your screen, there's an option to raise your hand. So if you want to ask something, you have comments to make and so on about the few things that we've just discussed, please do that. If you don't feel comfortable asking your question yourself, you can also put it in the chat. Evie, go ahead.
So first of all of this that you're sharing is very new to me. So thank you. Like, this is fascinating. My question, and this is not a pushback question, this is more a question of, so hundreds of years after the fact, some rabbis and learned people decided, you know what, it's so important, this is when you get signed in the book of life, right? You know what, it's so important. Like, says who? Like, on what authority and what information did people hundreds of years later decide this is what Hanukkah really is?
It developed, the short answer is that it developed slowly. I think no one could have gone in the 2nd century, 1800 years ago, and said like that quote from the Ari, from Rabbi Isaac Floria, be like, this is the Gemar Chatima, this is the end of the high holidays. No one would have listened. It wouldn't have stuck, really. But it did develop slowly, and we'll see later. Maybe I will get to it actually after this, because I do think it's interesting, to a specific text from the Talmud already that indicates that as a belief, it's not a matter of like a scholarly or academic like certainty that this is what happened, but they're saying a story that would indicate that this has been around since creation. That the idea of doing a holiday at this point, I would imagine, it's a bit hard to trace it because why, like in Judaism, you also have like kind of like between the end of like when the Talmud is codified in the 6th century, basically till around the 9th century, there's a bit of a gap in text. There are texts from every time, but like the explosion of commentary, a period that is called in traditional circles would be called the period of the Rishonim, the period of the early rabbis. Between them and the period of the Talmud, there's kind of like a gap where not a lot of things are written down. We know for a fact, and we know historically, there were 2 really big schools in what they called Babylon and parts of what's now Iran and Iraq. And there were definitely, like specifically in the Cairo Geniza, we found a lot of written stuff. And there's something called Shuvat HaGaonim, which are like a book that's from a lot of the responsa written in that time. But there really aren't, like most of the major commentaries, the major legalistic books and everything that we find, there's kind of a gap. And I remember even for me as a teenager, that always bothered me of like, what was going on in that period? And it's ironic that that gap does not actually align with what people call the Dark Ages, because what people usually call the Dark Ages is actually an extremely fruitful age in Jewish texts and Jewish teachings. But a lot of things that are kind of like coming out on the other side of that gap have already transformed a lot. And we'll see some of that period, going back to the 11th century, we already start seeing Hanukkah as a really big deal, to the extent we'll see a text from the 12th century, for example. One rabbi saying that I heard that there used to be people who wouldn't even work on Hanukkah, who would like celebrate Hanukkah like every other Yom Tov, like every other holiday. So it's a bit hard to really trace it other than to see references here and there. There's the book of Maccabees, which there seems to have been a debate whether that should become part of the Bible or not. It wasn't canonized, but there were people who were pushing for it. There is another book called Megillat Antiochus, which is a Megillah, very similar to the Megillah that we read on Purim, that we have evidence of that during medieval times, there were places where it was read the same way we read a Megillah on Purim. There were places who read that on Chanukah as well. And that is a book that they believed was written in biblical time. It was kind of a knockoff. We're not going to go into that whole conversation. But there were communities where it held the same value. And a lot more. There's a lot more to it. But to exactly trace it, you can find references to it. There's also an indication, you see that even in later texts where people are like that this is based on a holiday that is celebrated in the Bible that people would argue happened around the same time that we do Hanukkah today, which was the Chanukah, the housewarming kind of the Second Temple. And that might be part of the reason why it was necessarily 8 days, kind of the real historical reason. Like, we can all feel about the oil miracle, whatever we want to feel, but I have a feeling that a lot of us in this room are like not really believers in big miraculous things. And kind of the historical reason why it was really 8 days seems to be that it was taken from an existing holiday that was around the same time that is in several parts mentioned in the Bible. Whatever the reasoning is, it is the short answer. It is something that happened slowly. It is something that they relied on certain texts, like the fact that there was a biblical holiday, like the fact that the Talmud is saying that Adam and Eve celebrated a holiday around creation that kind of turns, and because the rabbis, Rosh Hashanah, the judgment day had a lot to do with day of creation, that became part of that. Yeah, but I can't say for sure. Other than it took a long time, I can't say anything for sure. Ari, go ahead. I can't hear you. Is it just me or is it? No, Ari, we can't hear you. Okay, I think
Can you hear
you're.
me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, wonderful. I to echo what Evie said, I'm learning so much. This is all new to me. Growing up in mostly conservative Judaism, none of the Hanukkah is either the war holiday or the commercialist holiday, and there's kind of no. And I've struggled for years and years to find what else there could be, and I know I'm not the only one who has. So I guess what I'm wondering up until this point is why hasn't this side of it caught on in the more mainstream? Why is it only in these mystical texts from the Ottoman Empire and in Hasidic communities? Why hasn't it become?
I mean,
Where's the disconnect?
this is more an anthropological question than it is like a my question.
But
I will
in
say
your
that
opinion.
I've been trying, I would say for the past 4 years, I've had threads on Twitter every year pushing back and sharing a lot of those things. And now, which is where this class came out from. I know we're recording this. Maybe we'll figure out even a way to share this publicly. I don't have an exact answer to that. I think a lot of it went the same way where like the Hasidic community is intentionally a very sheltered community. You don't get that many people who leave and still care to talk about it more. I didn't for a very long time. As I said, I left my community in 2012 and I only started doing this in 2021. So it took me a while even to like start caring of being like, here's what we have to share. I will say that I was surprised after leaving and starting to hear all this like Hanukkah is a minor holiday, Hanukkah is a minor holiday, and specifically hearing in a lot of leftist circles as both a pushback to like what I'm learning, a lot of people grow up with this very war version of it, which is, I'm sorry to say, ridiculous because the rabbis went out of their way to ignore it. Because they didn't want to celebrate war, because they didn't want that to be like, and it is mentioned here and there, but even when they do talk about the war, instead of focusing on the fact that they won, they're focusing on the fact that the righteous people won over the bad people, as opposed to they were so strong that they won. It is the righteous over the bad, the pure over the impure. Like they go out of their way to change the narrative, but then like with a lot of other holidays, I'm not here to give like to talk about how much secular and modern Zionism has like conflated stuff within Judaism, but it's definitely a big part of that. And I think in a lot of like leftist and progressive circles, there's a legitimate attempt to push back against like Christian hegemony that exists in our country. And it is, I will also say, and that part is maybe a bit sad, that for non-religious, for most of like secular American Jews, the fact that Hanukkah is such a big holiday definitely has to do with the fact that it falls around Christmas. 100%. I think my biggest argument, my biggest claim would be that instead of pushing back against that by pushing Hanukkah down, we push back against that with saying, we have been doing this for hundreds of years. We don't need Christmas for Hanukkah to be a big deal. And also, yes, to find like, there's definitely certain ways, the way we celebrate Hanukkah that has become, what's the word? I don't think that's a word. How do you say something became too Christianized or whatever? There's definitely part of that. And that's definitely something that exists. And like, we should push back against that. I just think that the way of pushing back against that doesn't have to be of putting Hanukkah down, but instead to look on what Hanukkah really was. And one of the things we'll see if we get to it, because the conversation to me is more important than just getting to all those texts, but even something like gifts, which the way it's done today, Hanukkah gifts, was definitely influenced by Christmas and influenced, but let's be honest, I mean, Christmas is already influenced by other holidays that existed around this time. And I do think that there is a point where Christmas is getting influenced by existing Greek and other holidays, and Hanukkah originally, that may be influencing those holidays. We're not going to go into that whole conversation. It becomes like step on step when you want to try to dissect it, and it gets to a point where you can't, and I don't think we need to bother with it. But there is references to gifts in the form of money, kind of the part where we get Hanukkah geld from, that dates back. There's solid references in the 16th century, but possibly as early as the 12th century. Before, and like, yes, you're going to say by the 12th century, Christmas already existed, maybe, though Christmas, the way we know it today, wasn't really celebrated that way at all. But I can't, as far as I can find, the references to giving gifts in the form of money on Hanukkah way predate any references of gifts and any references of Santa Claus, at least like in the versions that we know it today. So a lot of those things also, we don't have to let go of it. They are older, we have our own parts of it. And I think that's my biggest argument here. And like many other things, it became washed away when we tried to make nationalism out of it. Because Judaism essentially, specifically for 2,000 years, like the rabbis took so many steps to be anti-nationalist that we lost so much when we tried to make everything about nationalism. Okay, do we have any other questions before we continue? Okay, we're going to continue. I'm going to do a few more checks and then we'll take more time. So think of your questions, think of what you want to do. Okay, there's someone here complaining that they're not hearing anyone. Is there anyone else who has trouble hearing? Okay, I don't know what that is. I'm sorry. Okay. Let's get back to our texts. Actually, I want to skip ahead for a second, and because I mentioned it without planning, I want to go to this text. Who is the first person to celebrate Hanukkah? Now, this is partially a joke, the answer to this question. A joke, and by a joke, I mean a very, like, rabbi joke, which is not as in, like, I'm not going to be like, oh, haha, it's very funny. It's, like, kind of, like, not meant to be like, oh, literally, that even the Talmud argued that Adam was the first person to celebrate Hanukkah. But there is a reference here that kind of becomes, Evie, it sheds light on your question of how does this suddenly have anything to do with the high holidays? And we'll see, because it has to do with creation and the messaging around it. But I think it's a very cool story, specifically because at the end, the Talmud seems to be addressing the question of, is Hanukkah a Jewish Christmas? They indirectly seem, and I'm quite certain that that's what they're talking about. Okay, does anyone want to read this text? I believe it is numbered as 14. I'm going to put the text this way. Anyone? No one volunteers, I'm just going to call on people randomly. Any volunteers? Really? This is the quietest group of Jews I've ever met.
I'll read if nobody's reading.
Thank you. Go for it.
The sages taught when Adam the first saw the day was progressively diminishing, Adam said, "Woe is me! Perhaps because I sinned, the world is becoming dark around me, and will ultimately return to the primordial state of chaos and disorder. And this is the death that was sentenced upon me from heaven." He arose and spent 8 days in fasting and in prayer. Once he saw that the season of Tevet, i.e., the winter solstice, had arrived, and saw that the day was progressively it's progressively lengthening after the solstice, he said, clearly the days become shorter and then longer, and this is the order of the world. He went and observed the festival for 8 days. Upon the next year, he observed both these 8 days in which he had fasted and the previous year, and these 8 days of his celebration as days of festivities. He, Adam, established these festivals for the sake of heaven, but they, the Gentiles of later generations, established them for the sake of idol worship.
So to recap what this was just about, this is a story, basically, a very like the rabbis envisioning Adam and Eve as literally being the first people. And also, according to the rabbis, they were, for context, they were created on Rosh Hashanah. They were created so like the beginning of fall. So they start seeing like during at least in the northern hemisphere where most Jews lived in like where the rabbis of the Talmud lived, the days are like, you know, standard about 12 hours of light, 12 hours of darkness at the beginning of fall. And then the days got shorter and shorter and shorter. So these are the first people who have no context, have no one to talk to. And they were like, oh my God, what's happening? Like we sinned, maybe the world is getting destroyed. It's getting darker and darker and darker. And when it got to a point where it was getting really small, started fasting for 8 days. And then the winter solstice came around, which is on our calendar, December 22nd. And like, in fact, this year it works like perfectly because like literally Hanukkah is on December 25th. Starts December 25th and like the winter solstice happens and then the days start getting longer. And he's like, oh, okay, this is just nature. So then started celebrating. Great. So this is like basically, and then he's saying the next year and then going forward, he established this as a holiday. So this became a holiday for 8 days every year, right after the winter solstice, he celebrated a holiday. So this is already giving like an way earlier like origin to Hanukkah. It is also tying it to nature, which is something that I personally really love because most Jewish holidays are agricultural and are tied to nature. So this is tying Hanukkah to nature as well, even though they don't say exactly that it's Hanukkah, but it's very obvious. It's only 8 day festival, period. At least in Talmudic times. And then like it's around this time. But I like the last part where the rabbis go and say, and then they established it and Adam established it, and indicating basically that we have been doing this holiday ever since for the sake of heaven, kind of to like, thank God, oh my God, the days are getting longer again. And they, whatever, and this is the part also where the censorship that the Talmud went through throughout history is kind of hard to decipher who the original day was. And it could just as well, in all honesty, be referring to the Romans and the Greeks, who also had different festivals during this time. But they did it for their idols. We did it for the correct reason. So this might be the earliest attempt to push back against Hanukkah being kind of like a Jewish Christmas. In the way of we're not gonna diminish this 8 day festival. We're doing it for the right reasons, but they did it for the wrong reasons. Great. I wanna stop again and I wanna open up a bit more for people if you have questions. And I'm gonna say like we're gonna come to a lot more texts, some of the texts that we have skipped specifically, where the spiritual meaning of why Hanukkah becomes such a big deal becomes more evident. And a lot of it does have to do with the fact of there's a lot of, you know, it seems like there's a seasonal depression, so to speak, where it gets night so early, it's dark so early, and then suddenly the days are starting to get longer, it's becoming better, and like Hanukkah becoming a general celebration of light to celebrate that. Ronnie, go ahead.
So you mentioned nature, but can't it also be used in reverse to say if it is nature, wouldn't the earth has lengthened the daylight anyway, independent of fasting and prayer? Like meaning the 25th of Kislev comes, you wait 8 days, even if he just sits on the ground, the day will get longer.
Yeah.
So what I'm asking is how come, meaning it makes the correlation to Adam fasting and prayer. So I'm asking, can't it also negate the fact that had he done no fasting and prayer, the end result would have happened?
I mean, I think it negates the fasting part. You might have a good point. And like, there isn't, like, we don't have fasting leading up to Hanukkah, which is something that is also interesting. Like, we have fasting leading up to Purim, for example, which is a longer conversation, a longer story. And there's a lot of, like, throughout history, a lot of rabbinical conversations of, like, why, because the biggest reason for the fast day before Purim, traditionally called Tanit Esther, is because that's what they did historically. And then if you look in the book of Maccabees, there are a lot of fasting that they did during that time as well. And there are conversations around why don't we fast before Hanukkah for the same reason we fast before Purim. I'm not going to go into like perhaps it negates the fasting part, But the celebration part, that's exactly the point. A lot of Jewish holidays are about celebrating the natural world. So like we get like Sukkot, it's a lot about celebrating the harvest, celebrating the abundance. It is about being grateful for something that happens anyway. It's a very big part of like, spiritually, it's a very big part of Judaism as a whole, which is to celebrate stuff that happened and like kind of to not take anything for granted. And I will add to that given the world that we live in today, where we're basically destroying nature, it makes it even more. It makes us be in tune with realizing that we have a relatively fragile system, even today, that we need to be careful. So it's like kind of grounding us in nature, not to be like, oh, we have to do this, otherwise the days are not going to get longer. It's just like, it is being grateful for nature. It is not, we need to do this, otherwise nature is going to stop working. But rather, it's amazing and nature is great and beautiful and we want to celebrate it. Bobby.
Sort of piggybacks on what Ronnie just raised. So first of all, Adam fasted for 8 days. I mean,
That's how the
did you
story
drink water? That would be pretty remarkable. But the prayer part and the fasting is sort of like a vision quest, which many traditions have, and it puts you into a space, into a place, out of your ordinary way of being, and based on how long you go through a vision quest for, it can get pretty intense. But at the same time, you could feel sort of what you were just saying, celebrating and feel blessed. It's like a whole mixture together. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but there you have it.
I mean, I take it. Like it is true. I mean, that exists throughout. Like we see that in Judaism historically many times. There is Moses like when Moses was up getting the Torah, fasted basically 40 days and 40 nights. There's Elijah the prophet in the books of the prophets where he goes also and fast for 40 days and 40 nights. That's a theme. It's definitely a theme in Judaism that kind of like what you call vision quest or many different. It definitely existed in down basically to this day. There's not a lot of people, but there are still people, specifically very heavy Kabbalists, who will do. I don't know if anyone who does 40 days or even 8 days, but 3 days. I do know people who still do that. 3 days and 3 nights. But usually what I will say is, it's like what Emmett said. Usually fasting in the Talmud, unless otherwise indicated, only means sunrise to sunset. So it's very possible that Adam only fasted sunrise to sunset and then did eat at night. Which is most Jewish fasts. There's only 2 Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur that are 24 hours, but most of them are only sunrise to sunset. Maybe, I'm just saying maybe Adam only fasted sunrise to sunset, in which case the winter solstice is a great time for it. That is very true. Susan, go ahead.
I'm here because I'm kind of struggling with the religious basis, if there is one, or I haven't found one that's satisfying for Hanukkah, other than we like miracles and light is a spiritual experience. So I'm still struggling with that. However, I want to say that I grew up in a place where there were very few Jews, and we had candles in the window as a statement about that we were Jewish. And that was meaningful. But I still don't grasp, it doesn't seem to belong in a synagogue. It doesn't, I don't see the need for it to have some sort of religion. What you shared with us hasn't compelled me to feel that there's a religious basis for me to light candles or do any of it. I mean, I'm really struggling with it. The other thing I want to say is that the Hasidic tales about Hanukkah and light are very meaningful to me, and I read them on Hanukkah. That, to me, is the spirit of Hanukkah.
There are a lot of that. It's very interesting what you pointed out at the beginning, like you're not feeling like. So first of all, I think one of the things that I love about Judaism, and I went through my own journey from a very traditional upbringing to like rejecting everything to kind of trying to figure out what it means for myself. There's something that you can find, and it doesn't have to be what works for everyone else. Like everyone finds their own thing. I mean, I will say historically, like there's an additional part of lighting candles in the synagogue that seems to have been added way later. Historically, most of Hanukkah, I mean, there's the Hallel, there's the saying Hallel, there's the singing, the extra songs, which definitely existed, which was always kind of in a more communal setting. But originally Hanukkah was an at-home holiday, kind of similar, like we have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur is a more like synagogue holiday, Passover is a more an at-home holiday. Hanukkah was definitely more an at-home holiday. Like in the Talmud, for example, the obligation to light candles, it literally says it's ner ish beito, it's like lighting candles, every person and their household. So it's definitely like an at-home holiday. We see that, we'll see if we get to some of those texts about having meals and eating different foods and so on. It's a lot about at home. It's a lot about finding ways that work. I think what I would say is that Hanukkah has a piece of everything. It has a celebration around food, whether it is fried food. There's a lot about dairy. People know Shavuot as the dairy holiday, but historically, the eating dairy on Hanukkah most likely predates. Like there's references to it going back as far back as the 11th century. Something that I try to share every year, which is that the original latkes that we all know potato latkes, which are great and amazing, but the original latkes were actually made out of cheese. We have references to latkes in the 11th century in Europe. There were no potatoes in the 11th century in Europe. So like the cheese latkes predate the potato one, but a good 500 years, if not more. And it has to do with both the tradition of eating fried food and a tradition of eating dairy, which is actually a feminist thing. See later, maybe some of the texts that has to do with Judith, longer conversation. There is the nature part to it. There's the part of literally celebrating. The days are getting longer. It's getting out of seasonal depression. It is also like, and I remember that one of the Hasidic teachings I really related to as a child, and we'll get to that in a minute if we have time, this concept of Hanukkah breaking up the winter. Because without Hanukkah, for people who live with the Jewish calendar, which is what I grew up with, and it was the only calendar we had and what we followed, we would go from the end of the high holidays, the end of Sukkot, all the way to Purim, 5 months with no real holidays. And it felt on a very human level, nothing to do with religion, it felt extremely depressing. And Hanukkah is smack in the middle of that. Really, like, it's not by chance that so many different traditions, so many different cultures have a focus on light for their winter solstice holiday. And it's in a very like human and a very spiritual way related to reality, to what we're experiencing and so on. Yes, I know Miriam Cohen mentioned that Hanukkah, of course, on a lunar, well, the thing about the lunar calendar that we need to keep in mind is that the Jewish calendar is not a lunar calendar. We all know it's a lunar calendar. That's not exactly accurate. It's what's called the lunisolar calendar. The Islamic calendar is a good example of a lunar calendar that doesn't care about the solar calendar. The Jewish calendar actually runs on a 19-year cycle, and every 19 years, the lunar and solar dates align. So I grew up where we didn't really celebrate birthdays, but we marked the Hebrew birthday. And we all knew that whenever you turn 19 and then every multiple of 19, your Hebrew birthday and your calendar birthday are on the same day. Unless if you're born after sunset, then it's off by 1 day. The Jewish calendar is intentionally set in a way that it aligns. It gets a bit off, which is the reason why Hanukkah could be as early as around Thanksgiving and as late as mid-January, but that's it. Hanukkah is never going to be in the beginning of November. It's never going to be the end of January. It's always going to be around this time. And yes, it is on a lunar calendar. So, but even on a lunar calendar, something very interesting, if we do talk about Hanukkah on a lunar calendar, it is the only holiday on the Jewish calendar that starts when there is a very small to no moon. So the lunar cycle, the beginning of the month, there's a very small moon and it gets bigger every day until the 15th to 14th and a half day of the month. Then it starts getting small again. And if you look on the calendar, all the Jewish holidays begin either on a full moon, which is when we get Passover and we get Shavuot. We get Passover and we get Sukkot that start exactly on the full moon. You get other holidays like Rosh Hashanah, like Shavuot, that are in the beginning of the month. We have every month Rosh Chodesh, kind of like a very minor holiday that celebrates the beginning of the new moon. Hanukkah is the only holiday that starts on the 25th day when the moon is barely visible. And that is also very intentional. There's numerous teachings around that, and also with the fact that Hanukkah is the only Jewish holiday that straddles 2 months. It starts in the month of Kislev, it ends in the month of Tevet. So it kind of goes from almost no moon to the new moon starting to develop. So that becomes another big part of the messaging of Hanukkah, of like, we start in the darkness and then it becomes, and we'll see later there's some haluchic, some like legalistic obligations of when you light Hanukkah candles and it has to be in the darkness and so on. Okay. Any more questions before I continue? Okay, let's keep going. But Miriam saying like you were right. Hanukkah is not necessarily on the shortest day, but it's always on very, very short days. Okay, let's go back to our text. I'm gonna scroll up for a second to source number 5 that I skipped earlier. I'm not actually gonna read it because we're gonna run out of time. But I want to point it out. I'm going to read it myself, actually, instead of having some read it, just like to quickly point it out. So this is a traditional, what's called a L'Shem Yichud, for the sake of unification, which is a prayer that Hasidic people and a lot of Sephardic and Middle Eastern people who are influenced by Kabbalistic teaching say before doing every mitzvah. Literally every day before the 3 prayers, before any good deed that you do, you say L'Shem Yichud K'Tzarich for the sake of unification of the divine masculine and feminine, for the very short version of it. But so this is one written by a Hasidic Rebbe in the 19th century, and something that is one of the most common prayers. This is just a small part of it. But something that I remember already when I was a really young child is the last part. This prayer is like about 5 times as big than from what you see here. Again, for those of you looking, it's the source number 4 that I'm looking at. But the last part, starting Melocha Kol Olam Kulo in the Hebrew, or reign over the entire world with your glory in the English. I want to read it, and I want to see if anyone can pinpoint where this comes from. So this is stolen from a very specific prayer, and I'm curious if by reading the English, anyone can tell me where it comes from. Reign over the entire world with your glory, be uplifted over all the earth with your honor, and appear in the splendor of your majestic might over all who dwell or inhabited the world of your earth. So everything that has been made will know that you have made it. It will be understood by everything that was formed, that you formed it. And they will say, everyone who has breath in his nostrils, Adonai, God of Yisrael, is king, and his kingship rules over all. Does anyone know where this is from? I'm going to stop the share for a second so I can see your faces. It's not from Aleinu L'Shabeach. It's from a specific holiday. Diane, do you want to say? You're muted.
Rosh Hashanah.
It's from Rosh Hashanah. It's something that is recited in every prayer on Rosh Hashanah. So a total of 8 times, or if you lead the services, maybe even more. Melocha Kolora. It's literally copy paste from the middle blessing. So on Rosh Hashanah we got the Amidah besides the Musaf, the longer one, but most of them consist of 7 blessings. This is the middle blessing, and this is straight out of there. This idea of the kingdom of God, which is a big theme in traditional Rosh Hashanah prayers. And then he makes a reference v'amar kol asher neshama bi'apo, and every living thing that has breath in their nostrils, the word ba'apo is the same gematria, the same numerical value as Chanukah. But it's just like a reference, just like when you talk about prayers and you talk about Hanukkah being this minor holiday, I'm like, I grew up saying parts of the high holiday of Rosh Hashanah prayers. I don't know about you all, but it's also very interesting because we say it the same amount of times. So you would say that prayer, if you say it every night, you would say it 8 times, which is the exact amount of times you would say that prayer on Rosh Hashanah as well. So if you are a Hasidic person, that prayer, and you say this every year, this prayer will be just as much associated with Hanukkah than it would be with Rosh Hashanah, because you would say it just as many times every year. It's just like a minor, it is intentional. Like, it's not like you put it in there by chance. You put it in there as part of that teaching, part of that belief that this is basically the culmination of the high holidays, but it's more of a minor detail in that bigger picture. But I always found it, I love liturgy and I love playing with liturgy. So kind of that intentional taking it and then being actually also there's numerical values here that are just indicated this is actually meant for Hanukkah. Like I wouldn't be surprised if there is a Hasidic kid who opens up the prayer on the high holidays and they were like, oh, why is this Hanukkah prayer in here? Like if you don't know otherwise, you could totally go think that. But this is more of a minor part that I wanted to mention. Okay, let's go back to our text. I want to get to a few more parts and then we'll have more time for questions. So the next text is actually very important. I wasn't sure if we were going to read it, but we already seem to have a conversation around the focus being on the war, the focus being on the other more spiritual part. So this is a Hasidic text from a book called Kedushat Levi. It is one of the, if you think of canon of early Hasidic text, it is. I would put this into the top 10 most important Hasidic, most important Hasidic texts out of like hundreds. And specifically, he has something called the Kedushot. Hold on, I need a second. Sorry about that. It's something called the Kedushot, the holiness, which are things that he writes about Hanukkah and really dives into, and a big part of his questioning and like what he's trying to do is trying to figure out why do we do, like, not what is Hanukkah, like we had a Talmudic question, but also like why is Hanukkah a big deal? Why does it matter? Okay, so can I get a volunteer to read number 5?
I can read.
Go for it.
But for me, the inexperienced and insignificant, it appears to me, according to its simple meaning, that behold, it's necessary to understand why it was made a Yom Tov, and why Hallel was established, and praise about the miracle of the 8 days of Hanukkah. And Purim was not made a Yom Tov, and the wars of Sisera and the wars of Sancheriv which was a great miracle that blessed God wanted to make Chizkiyahu, the Mashiach, etc., and with the excess of miracles which are every day. Rather, the miracle that our ancestors and the original prophets and men of the Great Assembly saw, that they also exerted force in our good deeds, that these kindnesses which are revealed every year and in every generation and illuminate these miracles, according to the greatness of their deeds, which the original ones did.
This is a bit unclear in the style of a lot of Hasidic texts, and like I didn't do the translation. It's not the best translation. We could probably do a better one. Basically, what this is trying to ask is like, why does Hanukkah matter? If it's about wars, in the Bible itself, we have stories of the Israelites and the Jews winning way greater wars. Even in the context of the Greek period, like I mentioned earlier, the moment where the Hanukkah miracle is happening wasn't even it wasn't any decisive moment, really. Like the wars continued for another generation. It wasn't like the Jews in Judea at the time didn't really get sovereignty for another like probably 20, 30 years after that. And then they did. It's like, why? If it's just about wars, like why? What's the big deal? And he goes into saying something very spiritual, which is that the only things that became a holiday is if the rabbi saw that the story, the messaging around that holiday is something that can last for generations. He goes on to talk about later on in that same part, because it's both in the Talmud but also in the book of Maccabees. They say, instead of saying that they immediately as the miracle happened, they created a holiday, it actually says the next year they turn it into a holiday. And he's using that all to mean that it wasn't really a holiday because they won wars. That's not something that is worthy of creating a generational holiday. Only when they saw the next year and later on for future generations that he's talking in a more spiritual way, there's a lightning, there's a shine that lasts for generations that kept coming. Only when they realized, in other words, in our terms, when they realized that the message that Hanukkah has to offer is something that applies to every generation. And again, what I find so strong here is that he says just winning a war isn't worth that kind of message. If you want to make Hanukkah about that the Judeans won a war, there's many other stories. And just winning a war isn't worthy of celebrating for generations, only if they saw that the message is literally the light, the power that it can shed for future generations has lasted and it's worth it. That's when it becomes a holiday. I'm really sorry about my voice. I thought I was feeling better than I am. Any other questions before I continue? Keep going. Let's keep going. I'm going to skip the next one. People can read it later. I want to get to this part here. So I don't know how many of you, I know some of you were at my pre-Rosh Hashanah classes at Lul. So the next two texts were actually in one of those classes as well. But I want to focus on them and bring that home to Hanukkah. And I think we'll wrap up with that. Source number 11. Does anyone want to read 11? It's a very short one. Anyone with 11? Come on, people.
I can read.
I found that wisdom is superior to folly as light is superior to darkness.
Do you want to do this one?
No.
No,
And you give life to them all, yeah?
no. The other person who started.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Go for it.
And you give life to them all. You contract as if it were possible down to the lowest levels, and a portion of divinity from above is placed within the darkness of materiality. For the whole essence of the intention is so that the lowest levels can rise above and have the advantage of light over darkness. That is what is written, the advantage of light, that enjoyment advances when it is lifted from within the darkness, from within the brokenness.
So I use that a lot for our team during the high holidays, which was Ohr Bashvira, light in the brokenness, which is something that felt very applicable on that moment. But this is something that becomes, for me, growing up, it was the biggest theme of Hanukkah. That light at the most broken moment, the darkest moment. And one of the things that we see is this the quote from the Talmud as a halachic obligation, as a like legalistic obligation of when you have to light Hanukkah candles. The mitzvah of kindling the Hanukkah light is from sunset. It has to be done in darkness. It's actually very interesting because most commandments actually have to be, like specifically on holidays, have to be done by halacha, by law, have to be done during the day. Like on Sukkot, like shaking the lulav and the etrog has to be during the day, shofar has to be during the day. A lot of holiday commandments have to be during the day, but lighting the Hanukkah candles have to be at night. That becomes one of the strongest messages of what Hanukkah really is about. To like look on that moment of brokenness, that moment of real like feeling lost, the shortest days that you have, and exactly at that moment be like, we're gonna take action. So in many ways, it's also a message about when so much is broken, which has been on my mind a lot for far too long, and I think it has been around for the last 15 months, and it's gotten even worse in the past 2 months. And like we're really feeling like everything is broken and where we go from here. And like the message of Hanukkah is great. It's very dark. This is the moment to light candles. Both in the sense of Hanukkah happens during some of the shortest day of the year, whether it is like this year when it's basically literally starts on the shortest day of the year, whether it is just during the shortest days of the year when it's already dark. That's the moment, and that becomes, in Hasidic teachings, becomes this extremely powerful message, where Hanukkah can take the most broken moments, the worst situations that we can be in, and can shine a light on it. and kind of like the power that goes with that. I really want to leave, like we have 15 minutes left. We did skip a few texts. I can keep talking for a bit, but I really want to hear some of your questions. And I know that you have questions. We got 36 people here and only about 5 of you have asked questions so far. And I don't believe that the rest of you don't have questions. So I want to take this minute. I really want to encourage you all to ask questions if you have any. And I will give it a minute. If you don't want to speak up, you can put in the chat. If you don't want to ask it publicly, you're more than welcome to send it to me privately, and I will read it out. But I really want to, I know that a lot of you came into this with Hanukkah is a minor holiday kind of message, and like I'm curious to hear where people are standing. I'm hoping that at least some of us are going away from this where there is more to celebrate. There's more, whether that was something that you felt before now, even if you didn't, and even if you're like, for me, at least it was always still a minor holiday, this is still a moment of like, there are messages to find and to focus on. I really encourage you. I want to hear what you all are thinking. Diane, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm interested in the more mystical meanings of Hanukkah in terms of the light, the soul, how we take that in. I know it's about a 3-year course, but can you say a few things just to kind of highlight, no pun intended, some of the aspects of the more mystical Hanukkah?
There's so much. So much. Some of the most common, like some of the other prayers that are traditionally said before, there's a verse that comes to mind, which is Ki ata ta'ir ne'eri Adonai Elohai yagia choshki, which is part of a traditional prayer that a lot of people, traditional people will say before lighting Hanukkah candles, which is, for you, you will shine my light, as in like, in a Kabbalistic way, referring to my soul, referring to my inner light. My God, you will reach into my darkness. There is the concept, which is this simple idea that just looking at the Hanukkah candles can really reach to the depths. Something that is even more powerful than Hasidic, which is actually the name of this class, and we didn't get to talk a lot about that, but there is the concept of Ohr Haganuz, the hidden light. So in Kabbalah, and something that is mentioned already in the Talmud, and then like really expanded on in Kabbalah, is this idea that during creation, there was something called the Or Ein Sof, the light that has no end, the infinite light, or often called the Or Shivat Hayamim, the light of the first 7 days of creation, which in Hasidic traditions later becomes a title for the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and in the case, which Kabbalistically is an extremely high level. But there's this idea, something that Talmud mentions, that originally there was a light that the first people could see from one end of the world to the other, most likely not referring to in a literal sense, but having the inner ability to really see through anything and everything. And then God was like, oh yeah, this is too much, we can't deal with this, and hid it, which is called why it's called the Ohr Haganuz. And then on Hanukkah, as we light candles, and every day, I alluded to it earlier, similar to how like during the weeks of Sfirah, where like the first week is like chesed, mercy, and then you get strength and beauty and so on. But the same thing happens the first 7 days. Every day you work and focus on one of those virtues and one of those midot. And then finally, the 7th day, you reach that Ein Sof. You reach that never-ending light that comes out of the most, so in other words, the purest light of creation. And to think of it in a more like, in a way for each and every one of us, like a moment of being able to see something that you cannot usually see in yourself and in the people around you. And I will say, from a meditative perspective, there's a Kabbalistic custom of which I grew up with, which just staring into the candles. And in most places, in most communities, there's a custom, like you sing a lot. You spend half an hour, so you light the candles, and then you have to, I grew up being told you have to sit with the candles for half an hour, like not on your phone, but like sit with the candles. So usually there's songs. So like I grew up, we had about more than half an hour of songs that would take more than half an hour. So you would accomplish that. But actually, my grandfather on my mom's side, and like the community that he came from, and he would do this. He would just sit down at a like light the candles, grab a chair, sit down quietly, and stare into them for half an hour. Not saying anything, not singing anything. After that, he spent another 15 minutes singing, but just staring into that. And I mean, it's a Kabbalistic thing that by looking, you pick up some of those hidden light, but also from a meditative point of view. And I invite anyone, if you want, you don't have to do it for half an hour, but like just the experience of just not doing anything, just staring into candles specifically. I would say even more so if you light oil candles, they just have a different kind of flame. There's almost I don't want to say purity to it. I don't like the term purity in the concept, but there's like a certain way, the way they burn, the way they shine onto the oil. But even wax, any candles, just staring into the candles for a while, it does feel like it gets into your soul. It does feel like you're able, and even for nothing else, as a meditative experience of, for half an hour, I'm not doing anything, I'm just staring into the candles. And then when you're done, as a reward, you can have a donut. Laser.
Yeah, so you kind of just answered this a little bit in what you just said, but like, so I'm a very practice-focused Jew. Like I'm very action before belief, and like taking what you just said and taking this lessons, like if you want the Jews to like recognize that this isn't necessarily a minor holiday, but like I'm not gonna go to services and I'm not gonna start like singing Hallel. Like what practices would you like want to see like brought into action of like the quote unquote typical family who's like lighting each night and then like going into their secular world during the day?
So we did some of the things that I skipped that you can find in there. That I would say I used to do it growing up, and I do it again now. A few things. So first of all, that is partially that even halacha, it's even like law, but it's even more so gets expanded later, which is the concept of not working. Kind of like Shabbat, not exactly you're lighting candles, so maybe more like a holiday, but not doing any work things from sunset till you have lit candles and spend half an hour with the candles. So kind of really that like what I would really is like every night, kind of people should come together, like whatever, I don't know. Unfortunately, Friday night, I think we need to focus, it's a whole other conversation we need to have about Friday nights, but really like it's a holiday of coming together, families coming together with loved ones. Another thing that I would really like to see is what you wear. Unless like, yeah, I think a lot of families will have like one night where everyone dresses up a bit nicer. But I grew up as we didn't get dressed exactly like on the Shabbat and like on the other holidays, but we did put on different clothes, men and the women, everyone put on different clothes, like nicer clothes for lighting the candles, and then you stayed with it for the whole night. And you have to realize this is more than half of your day because we're talking here in the winter. So you put it on at 4:30, and the rest of the day, what I will say for me growing up, it was kind of a mix where the beginning of the day did feel a bit more, let's call it secular, like every other day, even though there was the Hallel part and there was like, it was always different. But then from sunset till you went to sleep felt basically like Friday night in a very strong way. Mine is the fact that you could like travel, you could do stuff, but it was very intentionally, it was very holiday. So like kind of recreating that. Big meals, not parties, not talking about parties. Everyone does Hanukkah parties. But meals, and there's some of the text for that and that we skipped. We had that. We had like not just like we did like one night Hanukkah that was a big meal, like some with grandparents on every side. But every night we sat down to a meal, like we would do, I don't know, almost like a Seder. I'm not saying do a Seder every night. That's gonna get very annoying, but kind of like you do Friday night. We did like you wash, you have challah, you have food that you usually serve on holidays. Like really, I really think that I'm a huge fan of food. Like people know, obviously some of them, like people know the donuts, people know the latkes, but those are meant to be parts of a bigger meal. Those are meant, whether it's some days dairy, some days meat, but like full or mix them. I'm not here to tell you have to keep kosher. I mean, like in a traditional sense, but like really doing the big meals becomes a really big thing, a big part of it. I think what I would really like to like for people to do this a lot more. And like this is, I don't know, I don't even know what people do on Christmas. I never celebrate Christmas. Nothing against it. I am kind of fascinated and I would like to do that at some point, just like to see, like be with a family that does it. So I don't know. But it does feel to me like we know how to do Jewish holidays. Even secular, so to speak, like secular families. I don't like those terms. I think every family in their own way, whatever your observance is beautiful. And it's just as legit. But like the same way we do a lot of other holidays, and I do understand it's 8 days. It's hard to tell people for 8 days to will say there every night. No one is going to listen to me. But kind of like to create it as something similar where like it really, and I think that concept of like really the nights are holidays, the day can be a bit more secular, but the nights are truly holidays is something that we can create. And there's more, but it's just some of the few things that come to mind at the moment. I think we have time for one more question if there is any. Sorry, I should rephrase that. There are other questions. If someone is brave enough to ask one more question. Lila, did you? Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
Hi.
Lila? How do you pronounce it?
I was just curious as to know what texts, because I'm very interested in this stuff and the Kabbalistic and kind of spiritual stuff about Hanukkah that we didn't touch on here. I mean, there's some sources that were listed, but beyond that, what would you suggest?
There's a lot. I would say so you can see a lot of that in like the source sheet. But I will also encourage you. So the sources, let me see what it's that specific book. Let me see what number it is. Give me just a second. 6. Okay. I don't know. 5 and 6 are from the same place. I don't know if there's translations of all of it online. I'm sure it exists somewhere, Safari, but Safari has some. I think a good start would be to start with that. And like if you click on it on the source sheet, the link that we shared, you will be able to, it will take you to those texts. And like to just read through them are very interesting. I'm trying to think if it exists online, something that is in English that is more accessible to everyone. That might be a bit harder, but I would say that's a good start. I will try to put out more as time goes on. But even just going through like clicking, because all of those texts, everything that I've shared, I've only shared small parts of it. So if you click on the link, most of them will have at the top. So the top part where it says which book it is, that's a link actually. And if you click on it, you can see a lot more. And some of them will have translations. And I think those are really good starts. I need to think. I feel like there are some good things that are more translated and more accessible. Do you want to like send me an email and I would try to send you stuff?
Sure, yeah.
My email is rabbiabby@kolotchayeinu.org. You can find it on the website also. If you send me an email, I will try to like, because I know it exists online. I just need to think for a second. But this source sheet is a good start, meaning not just the sources that I have, but if you click on them, every individual, besides the ones that are not on Safari. But the ones that are, if you click on them, it will take you and you can read more.
Thank you.
Okay. Unless there's anything else burning, I'm gonna wrap up here. Thank you all so much for being here with us. This has been recorded, so I think like if you want to like at any point rewatch it, we can probably get it to you. The source sheet, as I said, are public. Feel free to check it out. Thank you for being here. Feel free to reach out to me if you want something else. If I have the ability, I will send more stuff. Just really important, like Hanukkah is not the short version of everything we learned. Hanukkah is not a Jewish Christmas, but that doesn't mean we have to put it down. We have to make it, in order to turn it into a minor holiday, there's a lot of tradition. One of the things that I didn't even get to mention that to me, it was like the biggest part when I heard people saying Hanukkah is a minor holiday, and I was like, what are you even talking about? Is the fact that Hasidic texts, Hasidic books, and there are hundreds of them, the most voluminous in quantity. Quality is not something that you can necessarily measure, but in quantity, Hanukkah has more, most Hasidic texts have on Hanukkah more than on any other holiday. And there is a more like realistic reason for that, which is simply that because you're allowed to write, so like people were able to write down their rabbis teaching on Hanukkah compared to other holidays, but also the way it was published. They are never ending. Literally every Hanukkah, if any of you live in Brooklyn and you feel comfortable enough going to a Hasidic Judaica store, Hasidic, not any Judaica store, it has to be like in Williamsburg or in Borough Park. There's a place that I always suggest, a place called Eichler's in Borough Park. Look it up on 13th Avenue. It's actually run by an individual that is really progressive on a real level in his personal life, which is a whole other conversation. And it's really a place that we should support. you will see literally hundreds and hundreds of books just on Hanukkah, with like texts and books for children, and a lot of them in English as well. And so there's that part as well. Thank you all for being here. For any of you, if you have never been at Kolot, this Saturday morning is actually a great opportunity, great time to come. We have a race working group, racial group in our society celebrating their bar mitzvah. They've become 13 years old. There's going to be a really big celebration. I will be there Shabbat morning, so hopefully we'll see some of you there. And otherwise, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.